Thank you all for being here. I am so grateful that my mystic mountain woman friend, Clare Tager, who just, I don't know, did you just discover Eric Liddell this year, Clare? Or had you known about him and just started to read a little more about him? I can't remember what the story was.
No, I had no idea who he was. And I'm, you know, as I've shared with you, the only sports that I'm interested in or understand is things to do with horses. And so, you know, soccer, rugby, football, basketball, running, track. I know nothing about the heroes of those sports. So I was, in the mornings, I listened to Dean Kate, and then I switch over to Washington National Cathedral. So February 22nd of this year, one of my favorites there is Provost Jan Naylor Cope. And in her morning prayer service, she mentioned it was the feast day of somebody named Eric Liddell. And I paused it, you know, and backed it up so I could listen again. Michael would be horrified that I didn't know who Eric Liddell was, but anyway, I backed it up 2 or 3 times to make sure I had the name right, and then I started looking him up online because I wanted to know who he was, and I also wanted to know why we honor him in the Episcopal Church with a feast, with his own feast day. And after reading and studying him for several months now, I think he should actually be, you know, one of our great martyrs. So anyway,
well, thank you for being with us, Clare, and doing this. And I'm going to kind of hide our pictures and put this up on the full screen so you can.
Okay.
And you just tell me when you're ready for me to do my Vana thing and click, click, click.
Okay, well, we can, when you do that, we can go to the next slide because we're going to start with Jan Naylor's prayer.
All right, let me see. Let me go to slideshow, play from the start. All right. Next slide.
Next slide. So this was the prayer that began the service for the feast day of Eric Liddell.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Here we go.
Here we go. God, whose strength bears us up as on mighty wings, we rejoice in remembering your athlete and missionary Eric Liddell, to whom you gave the courage in contest and in captivity. And we pray that we may also run with endurance the race set before us.
Amen.
Yep.
So having heard that, I still wondered what's the feast day? How was he? What's about this word captivity? So can go to the next slide. I pulled up a YouTube and found a documentary called Champion of Conviction. And it was interviews with his biographer and one of his daughters, Maureen, who was 6 when Eric died. And it was one of those home done documentaries, which was short on money, but long on substance. It was absolutely fascinating. And then my husband and I rewatched for probably the 3rd time, Chariots of Fire. And then there was another incredible movie called On Wings of Eagles that I'd never heard of. And Joseph Fiennes, one of the Fiennes brothers, played Eric, and it was excellent. It was also scary and depressing, but I'm sure it was that way for Eric too. So that was a good resource. And then I circled back around to hearing when Chariots of Fire, there's this wonderful scene where Eric Liddell he was an evangelist, and what he included in his sermon was the quote from Isaiah, and that's, I think, on our next slide, if you can pull it up. Let's see, there's Wings of Eagles as the next slide. Chariots of Fire, of course, we're all familiar with. Next slide. And the next one. And that's a book that's been written about him. And then the next one.
All right.
Yeah, there we go. If it's possible to pull it up. If not, we don't have to have it.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to just end the show real quickly and
I have watched
pull up.
Chariots of Fire.
Pardon? Yeah.
I've watched Chariots of Fire multiple times.
I bet you have.
It's such an inspiration.
It is. You see it, see something different in it every time you watch it.
Yes, you do. Yeah.
Can you all see the screen? See the video?
Not yet.
Okay. I have to go out, stop share, come back in. Don't ask me why, but that's how it works.
There we go.
All right.
Yep, if you just hit play, maybe we can see.
Yep.
My text this afternoon is taken from Isaiah, chapter 40. Behold, the nations are as a drop in the bucket, and are counted as the small dust in the balance. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted to him less than nothing. Vanity. He bringeth the princes to nothing. He maketh the judges of the earth as a vanity. Hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary? Juvenile! He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no strength, he increaseth might. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint.
Oh.
Yeah, let me stop that. Sorry.
It's definitely worth rewatching the movie if you haven't seen it in a while.
I watch it once a month.
Once a month. I think some of us need to watch it daily. We forget about the wings. It was one of his favorite quotes, and as you'll see today, he lived his life this way. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles, and they shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. So we can go to the next slide. One of his other favorite quotes was from Luke, passages of scripture, for whomsoever will save his life. Well, let's see, I'm sorry. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. For whomsoever shall save his life shall lose it, but whomsoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So we can go to the next slide. So Eric's story hit home after even an outreach meeting I was part of, where one of the participants, Lynn, mentioned that outreach is broader than just writing checks. And in these days, we can hit donate, but it's actually the people who are needed to do the work that God has called us to do. Eric, in this picture, is a little boy. He's the one in the foreground with the kind of lost look as he stands next to his mama. He was born in 1902 in China to Scottish missionaries, and he and his brother were put into boarding school when Eric was only 5 and his brother was 8. He and his parents saw each other, believe it or not, every 7 years. Every 7 years. Eric was an outstanding athlete. He was always often called the Flying Scotsman. And even his headmaster at school described him as being entirely without vanity. So there's a word we discuss in some of our conversations, humility. Next slide. He became known as the fastest runner in Scotland, but he was also an evangelist, a very active one. He appealed to a group of people and younger folks particularly who would never have probably darkened the doors of a church without Eric's mentorship and encouragement and sharing of what he understood of God's purpose for him and for them in their lives. So as a devout Christian, he refused to run in a major trial required for the 100-meter race in the Paris Olympics because it was being held on Sunday. Even the Prince of Wales begged him to put aside the Sabbath convictions that he had and run for his countrymen who had never won an Olympic medal. We can go to the next slide. He refused, believe it or not, even the Prince of Wales. And then he was given the chance, not on the Sabbath, but on a weekday to compete for a race that he hadn't even trained for. And that was the 400-meter race. This was a quote attributed to him. God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his presence. We can go to the next one. Next slide. Eric's performance at the Paris Olympics in the 400-meter race, he won it, and it stood as the European record for 12 years. So the next slide. So again, what was, Chariots of Fire only goes so far. That's only part of his life. And I still wondered, so what's the feast day about for this, amazing athlete? This quote I love from Eric, and it applies to the second part of his life. Circumstances, it applies to our lives every day. Circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plans, but God is not helpless among the ruins. God's love is still working. He comes in and he takes the calamity and uses it victoriously, working out his wonderful plan of love. So next slide then. Harder days were ahead for Eric. He was a good friend of Peter Marshall's, and if you haven't revisited the sermons of Peter Marshall recently, that's been a trip too. I have the book, the movie, What a Man Called Peter, and I always loved it. But there's some things, as we get older, we hear and see different things in some of the book friends and movie friends that we pull off the shelves to revisit. So Eric, instead of staying in Scotland, England, or Paris, where he was honored and famous, chose to go back to China to be a missionary. And he said this: "It's been a wonderful experience to compete in the Olympic Games and to bring home a gold medal, but since I have been a young lad, I've had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than any that I have run, and that race ends when God gives out the medals. I believe God the Father has a plan for the world, a plan for my life, and some daily work for me to do. I believe in the Holy Spirit, who is able to guide my life so that I may know God's will, and I'm prepared to allow him to guide and control my life. So it'll be the next slide. So for 20 years, he served as a missionary in China. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis, as well as Peter Marshall. And as you know, Peter was a Presbyterian minister from Scotland who later became chaplain of the U.S. Senate. Catherine Marshall, his wife, wrote about their friendship and how much Peter loved Eric. Eric married Florence, who was also a daughter of missionaries, Canadian missionaries, and he and Florence had 3 daughters that he would not live to raise or to see. The next slide. So life in China had become dangerous in 1941 because of Japanese aggression. Brits were urged to leave. He stayed, however. He sent Florence and the children to Canada to wait for him. After he put them on the ship to sail to Canada, he came home to their home and found that the Japanese soldiers had ransacked it and even stolen his car. So he and some other refugees had to move into the school where Eric was a teacher. He became part of a rural mission serving the poor, and his brother was also there. At this mission that his brother was running, they were severely short of help, and the missionaries there were absolutely exhausted. They had very little food and no supplies. And then in 1943, ironically, on the very same day that Peter Marshall was addressing the cadets at Pearl Harbor, Eric was put into an internment camp, along with businessmen, tourists, and children and teenagers who had been separated from their parents. You can go to the next slide. He taught Bible classes, and he actually wrote his own textbooks from memory and used those with the children. His whole life became devoted to helping these kids continue to learn but as they were grieving the loss of their lives, their parents. The other adults in the camp were mourning the loss of their families. They were scared. And so Eric's answer to that was pray, have services, and let's continue to learn. He became to the kids Uncle Eric, and they loved him very much. A fellow inmate, a very prominent theologian, said of Eric, often in an evening, I would see him bent over a chessboard or a model boat or directing some sort of square dance, absorbed, weary, and interested in pouring all of himself into this effort to capture the imagination of these penned up youths. He was overflowing with good humor and love for life, and with enthusiasm and charm. It's rare indeed that a person has the good fortune to meet a saint, but he came as close to it as anyone I've ever known. So go to the next slide. He never saw his wife or his children again. He had a nervous breakdown due to overwork. Conditions at camp were horrible. There was malnutrition among all of the inmates. And on one instance, the commander of the prison camp had challenged Eric to a race because the Japanese commander wanted to prove that he was faster than the fastest runner in the world. So as you can see in this particular picture, the men were, and women and kids were hungry, they were starving. And so when the Japanese began to feed Eric better food and more quantities, they were only allowed 1 meal a day. And that was like a piece of bread and gruel. And so when Eric was being fed more rations, at night, he saved them, he hid them, and at night he shared them with the other inmates in the prison, particularly the children. So therefore, when the day came for the big race, Eric still looked like one of these folk, you know, poor souls over here on the right. Eric made it in the race for maybe 100 yards and then collapsed, which another inmate, furious, said, well, what do you expect? You're starving him. And so it came to light that he wasn't eating the rations that the Japanese were giving him, and he was put into solitary confinement for that. I was telling my husband last night that I did know a man a long time ago who had been in World War II, and when a member of the family was engaged to a Japanese girl, he just went into just this shock. I mean, he just said, I don't think I could meet her. I don't think I could be around her. And I thought at the time, well, gosh, that was a long time ago, you know, and it was the war, and war is hell. And, you know, now she's going to be a member of the family and we should embrace her. But after reading a lot about the conditions and the behavior, the cruelty of the Japanese, and I'm sure the US was just as bad, we just things we don't know, I can better understand that man's reaction in that facial features, not particularly racism, but just the association of a person with the same facial features as one that he had seen exhibit such cruelty to his friends might have set off that reaction. Sometimes you think of things differently again as you get older. So Eric was hospitalized. He died in 1945, only 5 months before liberation. He almost made it. But even with his brain tumor and his nervous breakdown, I mean, there were no doctors. His brother was there and tried to help, but there were no diagnostic tools or anything to help him. We can go to the next slide. This was an example that on one side of the books that he had made for the kids, and those are still at a museum in Edinburgh. The next slide. One thing I thought was particularly poignant is that there was a band, a Salvation Army type band at the camp, because they were ordered to play for the commandants, as it were. And so they were also allowed to play outside Eric's window. And he requested, as he was dying, that they play Be Still My Soul, which we heard this past week from another friend of ours. So the folks in the camp, of course, mourned his passing, and they couldn't believe they had to go on without him. Eric had a particular style of running, wherein as he was approaching the finish line, and you will see this if you rewatch Chariots of Fire, he would throw his head back and pump his arms in a way that was like, I don't know, two rudders on a boat or sculling. I mean, he was, he had a style of running that was just as unique as he was. And as one of the things that came to light in this kind of homemade documentary was that one of his students, who was then probably 14 years old, a little girl who idolized him, made it her business to go sit with him. She would sneak into the hospital to go sit by his side. And so she was with him when he died. So she was able to relate that his last words were, "It's complete surrender." And as he said it, he threw his head back the way that he would run. We can go to the next slide. On his tombstone, erected in 1991 at the University of Edinburgh, the inscription was there from Isaiah, the wings of eagles inscription. "They shall mount up with wings as eagles, and they shall run and not be weary." Go to the next slide. It's funny what you learn. I mean, I learned this just yesterday, and I won't dwell on it, but it is a wonderful resource, I'll bet. I'm going to order it. His daughter, Maureen, wrote a book published in 2017 called God and Me. And her last quote here, "I knew early on that if I wanted to understand my father, I would have to get to know the God that my father loved so well." So it's poetry, prose, and art, which Maureen used to become closer to his dad, to her dad, since he wasn't there to raise her. So we can go to the next slide. This is her book, God and Me. And then the next slide. This kind of cracked me up. "This search led me on an unorthodox and surprising journey that turned my world upside down. I first fell in love with God when I discovered he has a huge sense of humor. And I found myself totally surprised and in awe and laughing with relief. I wrote the book hoping to touch hearts, expand minds, and make people think about their concept of God, however they may perceive him. My father wanted everyone to know God, and this is my wee contribution to furthering his goals." We can go to the next slide. So in ending, I thought that this was the most appropriate prayer that I love, and you who know me and are my friends also love. We've quoted this a lot, but so in pondering the life of Eric Liddell, this is so incredibly appropriate. "Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours." So that's the story of Eric Liddell. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts?
I'm going to stop share so we can see each other. How wonderful, Claire. Margaret's got to go. Bye, Margaret. Take care.
Bye, Margaret. Peace, prayers, prayers.
That was very well done.
Thank you, sir.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
really was. Yeah. I'd like a copy of that.
I'll send you a PowerPoint.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, wait, I know somebody who can get it for you.
I know. Sitting next to her. Yeah.
It really makes us think, what is the nature of service? What are we being called to do? I mean, why didn't he just go home? You know, I mean, he had a wife, he had daughters. He was given a pass at one point to get out of that camp, I think through international negotiations, but he took that pass and gave it to a pregnant woman so she could leave, and he stayed. So when we think in terms of doing the work that God has called us to do, I just wonder, you know, what went through his mind in making the choice to serve many instead of going home even to his own family. I don't know, Linda, do you ever hear anything about him in Canada? I'm just curious. You're muted.
I haven't, but now I'm going to check it out. I'd like to know where she's settled.
Lawrence.
Where the largest expat community settled. My hunch is it was in Nova Scotia.
I think it was.
Okay, and then I'll check. I'll check. And I think it's wonderful that you help us see this full picture, because most of us only had that one slice, which was through the Chariots of Fire films. So my father was also someone who survived a prisoner of war camp. But that was in Germany and not in not under the Japanese. So I know that it was hard to look at the pictures, and the Japanese internment camps in particular are so horrific. So I had no idea. I had no idea about that. Go ahead.
Sylvia?
I could add a little bit about British attitude towards the Japanese prisoner of war camp, because the first job I had in London, the men went to a cafeteria away from the office, but the route to it took them past the Japanese embassy. All the men had served in the war. I don't think any of them had served in that area or knew people who did. But when we came to the Japanese embassy, they would cross the street, walk on the other side of the street, not in front of the embassy, because their feelings against the treatment in those prisoner of war camp were so upsetting to them.
Yeah.
And after they'd passed it, they would then cross back on the other side of the street. So that sort of backs up what you said about the man thinking twice about the fiancée.
Yeah. We had a Japanese exchange student, and it was through, I don't know, the international field. I can't remember the name of the organization. Anyway, as she was about to leave, as the school said goodbye to her, Yuriko opened the flag of Japan, because the flag of each country through the International Field Service exchange students, the flags would be hung in the high school auditorium. And I remember a collective intake of breath. And then they looked at this young woman and decided that she was the next chapter.
Next generation.
And so then, and so they released some applause to her, but I'll never forget that intake of breath, because that flag represented so many horrible things.
Barbara, did you have something to say?
I have a question, thank you. Of the films, the movies, other than Chariots of Fire that you mentioned, do any of them go into the period of time where Eric went to China and worked as a missionary?
Yes, Wings of Eagles goes into that. It's really quite an astonishing film. As I said, it's fascinating and depressing at once, but his days as a missionary, it touches on those. It all sort of dovetails. It's almost like a fast-moving train, moving into a place of darkness, but along the way, so much light. Michael, what do you remember about Eric?
I think you've touched on all those points. He was just an amazing, inspirational figure, and it was just the what would he say? Surrender, which is just amazing to think that he went through all that. There's a parallel. There was another runner, an American runner over here. I think the movie was Unbroken.
Right. Yeah.
Where he was subjected to the same horrors of Japanese just bad treatment in those camps. But he was similar in terms of his approach. That his commitment, particularly not running on the Sabbath. I thought that was took a lot of courage to stand up for his principles. So yeah, an amazing story.
Eric had another friend, I can't remember his last name, but he's in the Chariots of Fire film. It was, his last name was Abrams.
Yes.
Do you remember anything about him? I mean, he was running for the Jewish nation while Eric was running for his God. So two men who felt they had something that they wanted to prove through running.
That was an amazing contrast of those two personalities.
Sylvia.
Abrams commentated on the BBC on sports for years afterwards. And so,
Oh, did he really?
And so to a lot of us, he was far well known than Liddell was. Yes.
Wow, that's fascinating.
He had a whole separate well-known career afterwards. Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Which is what he was after. It was a lot about him.
Yeah. I'm reminded of that prayer that or the piece of scripture that we worked with for so long on doing the work God has called us to do with gladness and singleness of heart. And he certainly is the epitome of with gladness and singleness of heart in the way he lived his life and the commitment he made to God. Nina.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, welcome.
Well,
very shortly after the end of the war, which all of us kids were raised during the war times in Jacksonville, which was unreal, being in Jacksonville with all that had to go on. But there was an Oriental kid in our class, and we didn't know Japanese from Chinese, and it made absolutely no difference to us. He was a great person. We treated him kindly, which lets you know that children don't always discern the badness in life. And then the other thing is I watched it. Unfortunately for me, I remember way too much of the war. And when I first saw some of it, I thought this country may be headed in the same direction. And it's very scary. I have written about it in my book and the last book I wrote. And I have not put that book in a library because I have had to study people that have come to this country and why they came and what happened to them, and not necessarily at wartime. And I see too much of what's going on in our country right now that resembles exactly what went on in Germany, England, when people had to get out. But I do think that when I was a teenager, I started in a missionary society. Until I was probably 35, I still went to a missionary meeting every month. And I remember us studying about different missionaries, but I unfortunately don't remember Liddell. But I do remember others and what they went through. And of course, being raised in the Christian church, we supported missionaries very heavily. And so I grew up knowing about missionaries from the time I was a teenager. And I don't know how they did what they did other than the Lord was with them.
You know, what this resonates with me, though, is hope. I mean, I think of Pandora's box, you know, and the last thing that fluttered out was hope. This fella, and thank you so much, Claire. That was just absolutely magnificent. That overall, it was just really, really terrific. But he knew that sermon that he gave, and then the cut to the guys running. You know, I, as a teacher, have watched runners in high school, and those little fellers running their little hearts out. And I know that there is that little burst of energy that they pull from within, and their coaches tell them that, you know, to be runners, you've got to focus, and you've got to keep your eye on the prize. I've heard that so often. This fella had his eye on the prize from the very beginning. And yeah, it's sad and it's heartbreaking, and you look at the emancipation of those Japanese prisoners, and I had my dad and my, family were touched by the war, German concentration camps, D-Day invasion. But the guys that came home of my father's ilk, who were Christians, were better men in certain ways. I mean, they certainly were models for us. So thank you for that. That kind of was a historical perspective for me, to reach back inside and know what a testimony of just survival. And how could he do it? And how many lives? Think when you said he gave that ticket to a woman who was pregnant. Think what he did. And he couldn't do that unless there was something within him that was so powerful and so good. And I think that's what it says to us. Our book club just finished reading Emma Gatewood and the Appalachian Trail, the 67-year-old woman that golly, that walked this Appalachian Trail. And she did it 3 times, guys, and when she was like in her 70s. And at the end of the discussion, we all realized when she was 87 years old, one of her little tasks was cleaning the windows of her Methodist church. So all of us have that in us. It's just reaching down and tapping it. Thank you, Claire, for reminding me of that.
Thank you for being here and for listening. That's fascinating. Yeah, Grandma Gatewood. If anybody's not familiar with her, she's another inspiration. She doesn't have her own feast day yet, but yeah, she left her. Her husband was abusive. She left with a pair of Keds tennis shoes and a shower curtain, and took off on the Appalachian Trail. Got a ride to one of the entryways to the Appalachian Trail. Oh, but now her daughters are interviewed on YouTube as well to tell her story. But 2 things brought to mind is this really got me on a kick as far as learning more about not particularly the war, but some of the heroes and heroines of the war, whether it be the code breakers, or people who also left their families and their lives in order to serve. And I have been so bowled away by, my roots are in England, and there's a really wonderful special, like on PBS or Netflix or Prime, called My Grandfather's War, My Grandparents' War. Yes. Helen Bonham Carter, and Kristen Scott Thomas, and then 2 other actors. It's kind of like a finding your roots thing. They wanted to go back and see what part their grandparents played in the war. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's all things they didn't know about their grandparents. Because as you know, so again, the heroism of the Brits during the war, you think of the size of the country and the absolute determination. I don't care whether it's Dunkirk or some of these other venues. It's like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? They really did this. And so it was certainly a lot of people following the work that God had set forth for them to do. And many times it meant not only leaving their families, but certain death or being so traumatized that they couldn't really function when they came back home. But that's an excellent series on PBS. And I know that Dee and Van were missionaries too. Was it Cuba that you guys went to, or Haiti? I can't remember, but I think you know what it's like to walk in and have this amazing message to share, and probably not find open arms on the part of everybody, but to stick it out and say, I'm here for a greater cause.
Well, and Nicaragua is the poorest, next to Haiti, is the poorest country in our hemisphere. And I had post-traumatic stress when I came home. I had never seen such conditions. It was like a movie set. It was the most horrific thing I'd seen. So when you talk about somebody like Eric living that voluntarily,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because what's going on in my mind, he made these choices because of the power of God in him, the love, the communion between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and Eric was so genuine, was so entwined that those were the decisions that he made voluntarily. I mean, it wasn't. I don't want to speak for him because I don't know him, but it was like, well, what else would you do? This is what the God in me is saying, and I you know, it's just, I think, Claire, you've done such a good job of bringing that faith and that hope and that promise out in this young man.
Thank you, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
Just really wonderful.
Thank you all.
I love the way you discovered him and what it has led to. We are the beneficiaries of that. Really brought him to life. Next week, thank you all for being with us. Next week will be Scott Brown's Pentecost window presentation. And that will be the last of his window series. And then the following week, Michael Corrigan will talk about John Calvin. So thank you all for being with us. God's peace as we go out into the world to do the work God has given us to do with gladness and singleness of heart. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire.
Thank
Bye,
you. It's good to see
everybody.
you all.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.